Welcome to another episode of Sustainability Forward, our podcast where we unpack the complexities of the global challenges of achieving our sustainability goals. My name is Rishi, and with me is my co host, Carmine. Today, we are delving into the crucial topic of net zero. Carmine?
Great to be here. So, episode 9, Richie. This is a great topic. Let's break down what net zero really means. So, net zero, we know, is about achieving a balance between the greenhouse gases that we emit and those that we remove from the atmosphere. As we saw in the previous episode, this is a delicate equilibrium that involves reducing emissions and investing in activities that absorb or offset the remaining emissions.
Absolutely. As we saw in one of our previous episodes, or maybe a couple of episodes, we largely established that the natural CO2 emitters and natural CO2 sinks, they kind of balance each other at about 800 gigatons of CO2. So 800 emitted and 800 absorbed. But the human activity over and above that, primarily coming from the energy industry, contributes about 40 gigatons, a small portion of which is also naturally captured, but most of it actually goes to the atmosphere, which creates this problem of global warming, which is essentially what most stakeholders in the world today are trying to address, right? So that we can achieve the goals of the so-called Paris Agreement, right? And there are two ways to deal with it, to deal with this additional emission. One is to eliminate, and two is to capture, right?
Great point, Richie. And I think what is really fascinating is when we think about just this 5%, more or less, as you said, 40 hour over 800 gigatons per year, this 5% is what moving the needle. And please remind me, so what's the difference between eliminate or capture that you just mentioned?
Yeah, it's essentially we can liken it to doing something proactively or having the medicine after we have the disease, right? So eliminate means that we take steps to displace the CO2 emissions which we are doing today. So, for example, we need energy, and in the process we emit CO2 if we use fossil sources. But if those fossil fuels can, for example, be replaced by renewable sources, then we would not emit the CO2 in the first place, right? So that would be elimination of CO2 using renewable sources. The other approach is actually probably some call it a more pragmatic approach, or maybe it's closer to status quo. But the idea is that we once the CO2 is produced after the use of fossil fuels, that CO2, instead of letting it go into the atmosphere, we capture it in a place, either in a depleted reservoir or in some other form, such that it does not continue to contribute to global warming, and that is what is generally termed as capturing the CO2, right? And in whatever way we do this, it is important that the natural balance is restored, and this does not keep contributing to climate change, right? Which is why we are today asking the question: why is net zero so vital, or why do we even need net zero?
Yes. And so the urgency is really in the data. So when we look at the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the goal is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And this, in essential, is to avoid catastrophic limits. So net zero is our roadmap to navigate away from outcomes of
Mm.
this climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, we've said it many, many times. Net zero is all about tackling climate change, right? And this reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or the capture of CO2, as we discussed, many entities, countries, and companies have been contributing to this global effort to reduce the limit or to reduce or limit the rise in global temperatures that we've been experiencing. And of course, we know that leads to extreme weather events, and many other environmental impacts, which we have discussed in other episodes.
Yep. So today we will look at this more closely. We'll look at advantages. We'll look at challenges. Just briefly, for example, on the advantages. Um, so moving towards net zero can have definitely some economic advantages. It can lead to cost saving through energy efficiency, protect against future increases in carbon pricing, reduce reliance on fossil fuels that are subjected to geopolitics and market volatility. So companies and countries that are proactively address emissions are also most likely better positioned against risks associated with climate change, such as supply chain disruption and damage to infrastructure.
Yeah. Let's maybe move on quickly, to the strategies and the actions which can which can move us towards this target of net zero. So Carmine, can you help us understand what are these various levers to get to net zero?
Yeah, so it's a multi-phased approach, it's a complex problem. It involves transitioning to renewable energy sources, improving energy efficiency, reforestation, investing sustainable practices across industries. So, and the data shows that a combination of these levels is more effective than relying just on a single solution.
Yeah. Yeah, and does sound like a comprehensive strategy is needed to address this. So maybe let's explore what actions companies or countries are taking to address net zero. Can you talk a little bit about that,
Yeah.
Carmine?
So let's look at countries first. So we are hearing, and by the way, we are recording this episode during COP28. So countries globally are making commitments. Achieving net zero, so it's essential for them for long-term environmental sustainability. It involves planning and transitioning to sustainable practices across various sectors. So ensuring healthier and more sustainable environment for future generation. So the Paris Agreement has sparked a wave of pledges with over 130 countries committing to net zero targets. And as I said earlier, so this could have some economic advantages. We talk about energy efficiency, protection against future increases. But
Yeah.
probably we can talk a little bit also about companies, Richie.
Yeah. And I think on this front, companies are not too far behind either, at least some of them. So, for example, uh, Microsoft uh, has pledged to be carbon negative by 2030. Or you might have heard about the example of Google committing to operate on carbon-free energy 24/7 by 2030, right? Of course, tech companies use a lot of energy, particularly for to run their data centers, and so it's not a surprise that these two companies have come up with these commitments. But there are maybe three reasons why it's also beneficial for companies to do it. One is, to maintaining market competitiveness and innovation. So, consuming less energy, or developing more sustainable practices could give them a competitive edge. This culture of innovation can lead to new products, services. We all know, for example, that's the foundation on which Tesla was built, and that could open up new markets, new ways to expand. new customer segments, all over. Secondly, there is a question of reputation and social responsibility. So a strong commitment to net zero and follow-up action on net zero, I think, gives companies the credibility with its consumers, investors, and partners. So that's another reason why companies are doing it. And finally, what we also understand is that more and more in today's time, um, attracting investment and talent requires commitment to sustainability in one form or the other, right? So that's why companies are trying to maintain a strong track record on sustainability to attract both investment, but also attract employees and retain them.
Good summary. But let's look now to the challenges, specifically to some of the criticisms that are around net zero.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts there, Richie?
yeah. Well, quite a few, right? But if I sort of think, if there are maybe three areas where there is criticism. One is around the fact that it's taking too long, right? Or most of the commitments are coming too late, and we'll discuss about timing maybe in a little bit. But the fact that it has taken companies and countries too long to actually even make any commitment on paper, and even that has not been done by obviously all companies and countries, that's a major criticism. Generally, the industry, the policymakers have been late in doing anything significant. Secondly, there is the over reliance or this sort of optimistic assumption that certain technologies which not exist today or which have not been commercially scaled up will all of a sudden help us in addressing CO2 emissions in a big way, right? Direct air capture is an example. Even carbon capture at scale, commercial scale, I think is an example. So over reliance on these technologies, which are either pre-commercial or not there today, I think is another criticism. There's a third aspect of relying on offsets, right? Meaning I pollute and I somehow pay somebody to offset my pollution or my emissions, by doing something around carbon capture in another part of the world, right? And now, when done well, that could work, but the criticism here comes from the fact that there are many ways of sort of evading scrutiny of the market in this particular in this particular approach of carbon offsets. And I think that's probably a third category of criticisms.
Yeah, thank you, Rishi. And I think there are also political and policy challenges to it. So we all know, for example, wealthier, richest countries have contributed more to these historical emissions, but may place the burden of achieving net zero on poorer nations, which have emitted less. Um, so there is this kind of imbalance when we look at all the historical emissions. As you said, there is the lack of global coordination. Different countries have varying levels of commitment and capability to achieve net zero. Some of the criticisms are about corporate greenwashing. And you mentioned it, some companies may claim to be on the path to net zero without making significant changes in their actual emissions. So they're using more as a marketing tool. And finally, probably most importantly, there is a lack of standardization and transparency. So there is currently no universally accepted standard for measuring and reporting progress towards net zero. So this leads to inconsistent and sometimes misleading claims.
Yeah. In fact, uh, probably some of this, the examples of corporate greenwashing are also um, coming from this angle of who's responsible for paying the bill for these ambitious net zero targets or initiatives, right? I wrote a LinkedIn article a few days ago, but this is a question that I wonder about a lot, right?
Yeah.
Who pays for net
Yeah.
zero?
So what? What does it take to get to net zero? So, according to the International Energy Agency, achieving net zero emissions by 2050 requires an annual investment of around $4 trillion in clean energy. Governments, private companies, investors are all contributing to this. Sustainable investment reached 35 trillions cumulative in 2020, according to the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance. If we look at it conceptually, a lot of investors are needed, so a lot of investment is needed, and it's difficult probably to get from a private sector. So there is definitely the need for governments to step up here. But this means that the burden will fall off to the taxpayers in a way or another. So the private sector also has the responsibility to make sure that the capital is allocated in an efficient way, but also spurring innovation and guiding government spending.
Yeah, and it's not just about one government helping itself, but it's the international collaboration across multiple governments, which is needed. And we already see it in forums like COP26. Um, in Glasgow, we saw how countries came together despite all the challenges around it. Collective effort is needed, and it's important for governments to collaborate. So, for example, the UNFCCC, I think the United Nations framework for climate change, if I remember it correctly. One of the articles it has now, I think Article 6.4, is enabling countries to collaborate with each other when it comes to trading carbon across borders, right? Which was not well, even today is not a reality, but that's where UNFCCC is trying to make a difference, and it might actually collectively improve carbon markets globally. But it's not just it's not that everyone is just waiting for something to happen. Sweden, for instance, is well on track to achieve its net zero target by 2045, which is a lot earlier than what some other countries have promised. And even on the corporate front, countries like Unilever are not only pledging net zero, but also integrating sustainability into their core business strategies.
So, Rishi, we are mentioning timing, and probably we can, as a final chapter of this episode, zoom there a little bit. Because we're talking about 2030, 2050, and we understand it's a complex topic. It requires a lot of orchestration between different players. There is different level of maturity of technology. And it's all about timing. And this timing we're taking may have some consequences. But let's understand better what it means net zero by 2030, 2040, or 2050. What does it really mean? What are the consequences?
Yeah. So I think both 2030 and 2050 are essentially arbitrary targets, right? Some companies and countries have set a target of 2030, as we saw. I think we talked about Microsoft earlier. Sweden as a country has committed to 2045 for net zero. Many companies and countries have talked about 2050 as a target, right? So they are, in a sense, arbitrary. But there are some considerations why that might be the case. So to make a sustainable and substantial impact on the rate of global warming, generally it is believed that net zero needs to happen by 2030, right? But 2030 is only 7 years away, or maybe 6 now, very soon. So even though that will make theoretically a significant impact on global warming, it might be a little bit impractical, or maybe a lot of investment, as you said earlier, Carmine, trillions of dollars of investment are needed to be mobilized every year, right? So that And that itself makes 2030 a little bit of a difficult target. The other consideration here is around technology. As we talked about earlier, there is a number of pre-commercial technologies need to become commercial to make a dent on global warming, and that means that all of these cannot come up in the next 7 years, right? Which is why maybe something beyond 2030 in the form of a target for net zero is essential. And finally, it's not just about technology or these investments. It's the fact that so many different stakeholders, governments, intergovernmental bodies, um, companies need to be involved. That all that to happen by 2030 is quite challenging. At the same time, 2050
Yep.
is also not really a practical target, because we know that even if net zero is achieved by 2050, we might already be breaching the target of 1.5 degree Celsius temperature increase, right? So yes, the both have kind of its pros and cons, 2030 and 2050. But it's something that I think will evolve as we go on, right?
Yeah, and you're right, Richie. Also, let's not forget that the climate system has some level of inertia, meaning that it will take a little bit of time to respond to change in greenhouse gas concentration. It's not that we close the tab and everything will stabilize. And there are also some natural dynamics that will impact this.
So where are we now? I think we've discussed many different aspects of net zero today. What net zero means, the what, how, why, and when of net zero, right? But what is clear, despite all the lack of clarity, is that the journey to net zero is promising, because it will solve one of the biggest problems, or it will help in solving one of the biggest problems that humanity faces. But it's a very, very challenging task, right? And as we conclude this episode for today, we must keep in mind that discussions like this, engagement from the public are crucial in driving this conversation forward. And that's one of the things that we strive to achieve through our podcast, the Sustainability Forward, so that you, and all of us can stay informed and stay curious.
Yes, definitely, Richie. So probably to close it, net zero, we have to get there. This is probably what what we understood today.
Absolutely.
Great episode, great chat. Thank you, Richie.
Thank
Thank you all.
you.
Until next episode. Thank you.